In this lesson, we'll learn how to take measurements using a dial caliper. Tape measures and rulers are very common measurement tools. They measure accuracy up to a 1/16 of an inch and some to a 32nd of an inch. A dial caliper is a precision measurement tool. It measures to a thousandth of an inch. Let's look at the number 1.525. The 1 represents the ones place, followed by the decimal point. The first 5 is the tenths place. The 2 is the hundredths place. And the last 5 is the thousandths place. Let's look at the parts of a dial caliper. First, we have the lower jaws for external measurement. The diagram here shows the external jaws measuring the diameter of a circle. They can also be used for measuring items like the lens on a GoPro camera. The next part of the dial caliper is the upper jaws. It's for internal measurement. Like on this bottle cap, the jaws are used to measure the internal diameter. Another way in which we can measure using the dial caliper is using the depth rod. It allows us to plunge down into a hole to measure its depth, or in this case, measure from the top of the GoPro camera to the desk. The bezel nut is used when zeroing the dial caliper. We loosen the bezel nut up, set the dial to 0, and then tighten the bezel nut back up. This is what the dial caliper looks like when it's properly zeroed. Notice that the lower jaws are closed and the dial is on 0. Let's look at the scale. It shows tenths of an inch and whole numbers. Let's look at the dial. The dial shows hundredths of an inch and thousandths of an inch. This is the dial indicator needle. In this particular instance, it's pointing to 94 thousandths of an inch. Next, we have the clamp screw. This is what we put our thumb on to move the dial back and forth or to adjust the scale on the dial caliper. Lastly, we have our reference edge. It is used along with the scale to determine tenths of an inch and whole numbers. Now let's look at this dial caliper and determine what the measurement reading is on it. First, let's start with the whole numbers. It's between the whole number 1 and 2, so it's got to be between 1 and 2 inches. Remember, at this point, we're using the reference edge. Let's write down the 1 inch. Now let's measure the tenths of an inch. If we look at the scale, we can notice that the reference edge is between the 2 and the 3. So we're going to write down 0.2. Now let's look at the dial. It'll give us our hundredths and thousandths place. If we notice the needle, it's pointing to the 16. So we're going to write down 0.016. Now if we add everything together, we'll get 1.216 inches. Remember, the dial caliper is only as accurate as you are. Make sure that dial caliper is zeroed out and make sure you're very precise with your measurements. Let's walk through this one together. Notice the reference edge is between the 0 and the 1, so it's not quite 1 inch yet. Then I'm going to go to my tenths value. It's between 0.4 and 0.5, so I'm going to write down 0.4. And then I'm going to go look at the dial, and the dial was at 46, so I'm going to write down 0.046. So my answer is 0.446. Let's see if you can do this one on your own. Did you get 3.275? If so, you did it correctly. Congratulations. Here's a fraction to decimal conversion chart listing the eighths, 16ths, 32nds, and 64ths of an inch fractions and their decimal equivalents. Some common ones: 0.125 an eighth of an inch, 0.25 a quarter inch, 0.375 3/8 of an inch, and 0.5 a half inch. At this point, I would suggest you get your dial caliper out and do some practice measurements. This way it'll make it a lot easier when you really need to use the tool.